Hello and welcome back to this week's episode of Closed by Mo. My name is Mohammed. I'm hopefully your favorite YouTube host on most things real estate, or at least I would hope. I'm a real estate investor and a broker in New York City, and in this week's episode, we're going to focus a lot more on the commercial leasing side of things, talking about the three different types of commercial leases that exist out there. Of course, there's a couple of different variations, as well as a couple of variations of each of these type of categories of leases, that is, gross leases, net leases, and percentage leases. But without further ado, let's jump right into this so you can finally learn a little bit more in detail about the different lease types. Now, the first type of commercial lease is probably the most common type that you may already be familiar with, especially if you're renting out a property of your own. That is a gross lease. In a gross lease, also known as a full service lease, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, the tenant will pay like a fixed all-inclusive amount, pretty much similar to if you're like renting out an apartment and you're not paying any of the utilities. In a gross lease or a full service lease, basically all the costs and expenses are already accounted for in the actual lease payment in it of itself. Meaning, as the commercial tenant, you're basically responsible for paying that one monthly lease amount and then absolutely nothing else, right? Now, the advantages of something like this is that, of course, it's going to be very predictable for you as a tenant to know what your monthly expenses are, because you already know, hey, my monthly lease payment is this much. It's a gross full service lease. I don't have to worry about anything else. It's also very simple, right? You're just like, hey, this is the number that I have to pay. That's it. It's also very ideal, especially for being flexible with your budget in terms of understanding where your monthly expenses are going to be month in, month out. Now, the typical cons of this is that usually in a gross lease, your payment's going to be higher because the landlord has already accounted for a lot of the ongoing expenses into that lease payment in and of itself. So you might not be paying separate utility bills, things like that, but the landlord has definitely accounted for that in the gross lease payment itself. And a second con to this is usually landlords will also, bake in a stronger escalation clause in the gross lease amount, meaning every single year or every single renewal period, your lease amount is going to be increasing at a steady rate. It's not to say that it doesn't happen for other lease types as well, but typically for gross leases, it's going to be a little bit more aggressive in the favor of the landlord, because obviously the tenant is not responsible for any of the ongoing maintenance, utilities, or property taxes or anything of the property itself. Now, the second type of lease is what we call a net lease. Now, in a net commercial lease, there's actually a couple of different variations. You have the single net, double net, triple net, things like that. In a single net lease, the tenant will actually pay not just for the base rent, but also their portion of the property taxes, which might be calculated based on whatever the landlord and the tenant have in mind. Most of the time, what I've seen is it's usually off of the square footage that the tenant themselves is occupying. In a double net lease, the tenant will pay their base rent, the property taxes, as well as the property insurance as well. Meaning that instead of just paying the monthly lease payment, the tenant is now responsible for their portion of the taxes as well as their portion of the building or property insurance. And in a triple net lease, this is basically mail check money for the landlord, as in the tenant is going to be responsible for everything: the base rent, taxes, property maintenance, insurance, everything on top of whatever their base rent is already paying. Now, you might be asking, why on earth would the tenant ever agree to any kind of net leasing? Well, here's why. There's a couple of advantages, right? The first is they just have more control, right, over the property itself. So they have more control over how much utilities and they might use, how much property maintenance they might, how much they might spend on property maintenance. Basically, they're allowed to be able to spend however much or however little they want on those things. Therefore, they have a little bit more control over the lease itself, as opposed to a landlord coming in and saying, "Hey, we're going to charge you an extra $100,000 because we had to maintain the property, this or that." So it just lets them, it lets the tenant have more control over effectively managing their costs. And the second advantage is you're going to have a lower base rent amount, meaning the actual base rent that you'll be paying off of that lease is going to be lower than what you would have paid, let's say, in a gross lease. So that might be an advantage based on how you're sort of structuring the entire transaction itself. And as a tenant, that might even work out more in favor for you, depending on maybe how effectively cost effectively you're taking into account or writing off your business expenses, things like that. The disadvantages, obviously, is that it just costs more for the tenant, right? There's more responsibilities for the tenant. It's more expensive in most cases, and overall, you're just going to have a higher level of operating costs. The second disadvantage also is that as a tenant, you're just going to face unpredictable costs, right? You have no idea of knowing if in, let's say, 2 years into your 10-year lease, the county decides to raise property taxes. So now you're on the hook for your portion of the increase in property taxes, which you maybe would not have even considered factoring into your overall lease expenses or your overall business expenses. So that might throw a wrench in things. It could also be that maybe utility costs suddenly skyrocket, right? That does happen, especially on the East Coast here whenever we have really cold winters. So that's just something that is a disadvantage for the tenants overall. Now, in a percentage lease, which is the third type of lease, this is mainly more common where you're seeing like commercial spaces that are set up for like retail or shopping, things like that. Basically a lease structure where the landlord is not just getting the base rent, but they're also getting a certain percentage of the overall gross sales after a certain threshold, which obviously might sound like a lot, but allow me to explain. It's basically like, let's say for example you have a store, and in negotiation, you get a very good favorable discounted rate from your landlord, but the landlord then says, okay, well, this is going to be a percentage lease, and if you make over $100,000 in gross sales every single month, then I get 5% of anything above 100,000 of the gross sale itself. And mind you, this is gross sales. This is not net after your expenses. This is gross. So you have to make sure you factor in that percentage into your overall cost of goods sold and things like that. But of course, this percentage is negotiated between the landlord and tenant depending on how the overall lease is structured. Now, the advantage of something like this for the tenant is that the rent amount most of the time is tied directly to the overall business performance, which is a good thing, right? If your business is doing well, you have higher sales, you're able to pay more. And if business is not going well, then your payment drops, which a lot of people typically like because it's a lot more in flux. And of course, you'll also be able to there's the added benefit that, of course, if the landlord is incentivized to make sure that you do successfully as a business, because now their bottom line is tied to how well you do, there's going to be an overall incentive for the landlord to make sure, one, that you're happy, and two, that your space is also set up and clean and maintained well, because if you're not doing well, then the landlord is definitely not doing well. Now, the disadvantages of any kind of a percentage lease is, of course, figuring out the right percentage that makes most sense for both the tenant and the landlord, because you have to remember that you are giving up a percentage of the gross payments or the gross sales after a certain threshold. And of course, the disadvantage as well is that you're just going to have really inconsistent monthly expenses. So it's going to be difficult for you to sort of plan ahead because you have no idea of knowing how much your final lease payment is going to be for that specific month, because it depends a lot on what your monthly sales volume is like. I hope you enjoyed this video. I definitely had a lot of fun making it. I always end up learning a couple of things while I'm doing the research for these videos. So I hope you guys got a couple of takeaways as well. And I hope you're going to be able to invest or buy or sell, whatever you're doing in commercial real estate. Happy investing, buying, selling, all that fun stuff. I'll see you guys next week.